this election is primarily about the quality of the individuals we elect as our representatives to Parliament. Now, I think it's an important factor. It's not insignificant. But I do not think that this election, the election of August 17th, 2015, is primarily or principally about the quality and the biodatas of our elected representatives. I shall tell you why in a moment. Nor do I think that this is about a need for all of us to rally and keep President Rajapaksa out of Parliament, because, as the UNF says, he's guilty of financial corruption, let's say it very frankly. Now, why do I reject these interpretations? The reason is very clear. The Sunday Times, Colombo, which is a respected newspaper, owned incidentally by the uncle of the Honorable Prime Minister, Mr. Wickremesinghe, had a very interesting political column many months ago on the occasion of the visit of Secretary of State of the United States, John Kerry. The article stated that our foreign minister, certainly for another 10 days, Mr. Mangala Samaravira, made a request of Secretary of State Kerry. And that was that special teams of the United States be deployed in Sri Lanka to help track the financial misdeeds of President Rajapaksa and his family. Pursuant to that request, which was granted immediately by Secretary of State John Kerry, there was a very interesting deployment in Colombo, and that was the deployment of the U.S. Homeland Security and another team from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now, ladies and gentlemen, as you well know, Homeland Security is a very important agency which was created after the terrorist attacks of 9/11. The mandate of Homeland Security is to protect the homeland of the United States. What that has to do with Sri Lanka, I do not know. And I certainly didn't think that President Rajapaksa posed a threat to the U.S. homeland in terms of terrorism. But one thing that Homeland Security is very, very good at is tracing money flows. That's how they interdict terrorists. They trace money flows of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, the Taliban, and then they take out the terrorists. So if there's anybody who really knows how to track illegal money flows, it's U.S. Homeland Security. And a U.S. Homeland Security team was lodged here, probably still is, at the request of Honorable Mangala Samaravira. As backup, there is this team from the U.S. Department of Justice. Now, if U.S. Homeland Security, having been based here for many months and having all the resources that the United States provides, was unable to pick up anything untoward in terms of financial flows on the part of President Rajapaksa and his family, I really don't think there was any such thing. Now, I know I've always felt that he's a very intelligent man. Only a very intelligent man could have defeated the most powerful terrorist militia in the world. But I hope he will not misunderstand me when I say that while I think he's very, very intelligent, he's not that clever. He can't cheat U.S. Homeland Security. If he had been hiding money somewhere, they would have found it. But Homeland Security couldn't find it because there was no such thing. Therefore, I think it's a dastardly lie. So this is not about President Rajapaksa's accounts. This is not primarily about who you send to Parliament. It's about other things. It's about two very big matters. One is the choice of a Prime Minister. We are downstream from the 19th Amendment, which means that the office of the Prime Minister is far more important than it has been since 1978, the Java Constitution of 1978. It is obviously not as powerful as it was under the 1947 or 1972 constitutions, but it's halfway between 72 and 78. So it matters. It matters much more than who you elect as your representative. It matters that you choose either Mr. Wickremesinghe or Mr. Rajapaksa as our Prime Minister. Now, all of you have made choices in terms of employing and deploying personnel. And you know the criteria that you use. I'll come to that in a moment. But the second issue, the first issue is who do we choose as Prime Minister from these two people? Because this time around, nobody's going to appoint Anura Kumara Dissanayake of the JVP as the Prime Minister. A vote for the JVP is only a vote either for Ranil Wickremesinghe or against Mahinda Rajapaksa in the prime ministerial stakes. That's what's going on. It's the premier stakes, to use the title of a well-known book about Sri Lankan politics in decades past. The second issue is which future for Sri Lanka. Now, I shan't go into great detail. Dr. Godaheva has already done that, and Professor Piris has elaborated. I will just flag one or two issues which are big picture issues, macro issues, as big as the picture can get. Now, this is what I want you to hold in your mind when you go into vote on August 17th. Who is to be the PM and what future do we want? Now, in the choice of Prime Minister, I think we have to look at the two files. It's rather simple. We have to pick somebody for a job. Whether the job is that of a waiter, a security guard, or Prime Minister, you go on the basis of the CV, of the track record. What has this person done and what has he or she failed at when they've held various jobs? Now, Mr. Wickremesinghe has had three significant spells in government. One is in the administration of 77 up to 1994, the UNP's Jayawardene and Premadasa administrations. The second is as Prime Minister in 2001, 2004, and the third is the latest stretch. I shan't go into detail, I don't have the time. I just want to flag some issues that distress me. They may or may not distress you. One falls into the category of what the Americans call character questions. I'm not talking about personality traits. I'm talking about political behavior and personal behavior in the public domain, in important matters. Now, you're all familiar with the report of the Batalanda Commission of the year 2000. I am not going to speculate on of any role which Mr. Wickremesinghe may or may not have had in those matters. I'm willing to give him the benefit of the doubt. But I do have a problem. And the problem is this. Sri Lanka has had three violent insurrections, one in April 71, the other a long 30 years war in which General Jerry De Silva was a distinguished commander, and there was a southern insurrection, a second southern insurrection. We also know of violent insurgencies, and they're putting down throughout the world. Now, never did any Sri Lankan politician, political leader, whose responsibilities included the restoration of law and order and the suppression of terrorism, choose to leave their residences in Colombo and take up residence adjacent to a torture and extermination center. Nobody. Madam Bandanayake and Felix Das Bandanayake didn't do that in 71. Lalit Athurath Mudali and Ranjan Wijeratne didn't do this during the 30 Years' War. Ranjan Wijeratne and Sirisena Kure didn't do this in putting down the second JVP insurgency. I wonder why somebody who has a house in Inner Flower Road, which is far easily defensible than a house outside of Colombo, should take up residence next to a torture chamber. That is what is known as a character issue. And given that character issue, I wonder whether I would feel comfortable entrusting the destinies of the nation to such a person in the capacity of Prime Minister. I really have a problem with that. The second time out was when Mr. Wickremesinghe was Prime Minister in 2001, 2004. We have it on the authority of Professor Paul Moorcraft, who was a senior military instructor at Sandhurst, from which at which Jerry topped the batch of foreign students when he was at Sandhurst. Professor Moorcraft wrote a book on the Sri Lankan war called The Total Destruction of the Tamil Tigers. It was published in London by Pen and Sword Publishers. I was privileged to be invited by him to speak at the launch of his book in Colombo. And I was horrified by what I read in that. Professor Moorcraft says that on the 20th of December 2001, a long-range reconnaissance patrol of the Sri Lankan Special Forces was in hiding in the Mullaitivu jungles. They had impeccable information that Velupille Prabhakaran would be visiting a place nearby on Christmas Eve or on Christmas Day, and they were set to assassinate him. Had that decapitation strike taken place, the war would have either been brought to an end in 2001, or we would have had an expeditious, peaceful settlement, because the Tigers would have been greatly weakened. That operation was called off by Prime Minister Wickremesinghe despite the entreaties of the army commander of that time and of the Directorate of Military Intelligence. They pleaded with him that it would end the war one way or the other. But he called it off, and he did more. He and his minister, Mr. John Amaratunga, sent the police to raid the Directorate of Military Intelligence safe house, which provided backup for that operation in Mullaitivu. That was the famous Millennium City Athurigiriya raid. The interrogations that followed that raid yielded a number of names of our operatives in LTT-controlled areas. 42 of them were assassinated by the Tigers. Now, to me, that's an act of gross irresponsibility bordering on the criminal. In any other society, such as France, where I served as ambassador, any politician who was found acting in such a way towards the fascists would be prosecuted and certainly debarred from politics. We've been far more tolerant. Now, ladies and gentlemen, if I were to hire a security guard or even a domestic servant, I would not hire somebody who let thieves into the house or saved them when he was in charge of the security of the establishment. Mr. Wickremesinghe's ceasefire agreement was criminally lopsided. It permitted the Tigers to re-enter the areas that we had liberated. Jerry headed the operation which liberated Jaffna in December 1995. That act was undermined by the CFA, which permitted the Tigers to go back, and I'm sure he would have been horrified that a few years after that liberation, the Tigers were celebrating Pongu Tamil in the areas that he and his soldiers had liberated for all of us. Now, the flip side is that we, the democratic state, was not allowed to go into the areas controlled by the Tigers, according to Mr. Wickremesinghe's CFA. A CFA that he did not show the cabinet before he signed. Now, that is not the sort of person I would entrust the destinies of our country to. And finally, we have his 6-month stint. I shan't go into the details of the bond scam. Frankly, I'm not very good with figures. But I do have a different problem. And that is the appointment of a non-citizen of Sri Lanka, not a dual citizen, but a non-citizen of Sri Lanka as the governor of the central bank. Now, this has nothing to do with ethnicity. My good friend, Dr. Indrajit Kumaraswamy, would have been a splendid governor of the central bank. But he was shortlisted and not chosen. Instead, you had somebody who has no responsibility towards Sri Lanka because he had relinquished his citizenship. And any prime minister who can appoint such a person is perfectly capable of opening up the Sri Lankan economy to complete and total diasporization. And I don't think that that is the kind of future we want. Now, that's the track record. On the other hand, we have President Rajapaksa, who not only did something that his far better placed predecessors, Jayawardena, Ranasinghe Premadasa, Chandrika Banaranaike Kumaratunga, D.B. Vijayatunga was an interim figure, and Ranil Wickremesinghe were unable to do. He did something which we can see on our television sets is very difficult even for the United States to do, whether it is in Afghanistan or Iraq, which is to liberate a country from terrorism. So, even from a global point of view, you have a man of remarkable skill, determination, and achievement. And he is offering to work for us, again, this time in the capacity of Prime Minister. I don't see why we shouldn't hire him. It doesn't make sense to me. He also revived the economy. He didn't rest on his laurels. My wife Sanja and I were privileged to be in Singapore. I was a senior research fellow when Professor Pires came along for the Shangri-La dialogue and conveyed an invitation from President Rajapaksa for me to return to diplomatic service. And while we were in Singapore, we were attending an annual symposium which was addressed by, at the time, the Deputy Prime Minister of Singapore was also the Minister of Defense. And he didn't know that there were two Sri Lankans in the room when he said to his global audience that outside of China, the highest growth rate in Asia was that of Sri Lanka. I was very proud. I had a few problems with the government at that time, but I immediately wrote an article based on that, and I sent it to the island, which published it under my name on the front page, because it was wonderful just to hear that coming from the Singaporean Deputy Prime Minister. And that was the achievement of President Rajapaksa. So what's not to like, as the kids say? I mean, here you have these two CVs. Why would any of us make a rational decision to appoint Ranil Wickremesinghe rather than Mahinda Rajapaksa as an empowered Prime Minister in the post-19th Amendment Sri Lanka? I just do not understand it. Now, my second and final point, because President Rajapaksa has to leave us to move on to another speaking engagement. I was talking about the second thing that this election is about. The first is to pick a PM, the Premier stakes. The second thing is the big picture, the really big picture. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there are two stories which appeared in the Indian press which I would draw your attention to. This would supplement, it would round off some of the the disturbing international trends that Professor Pires adverted to in his own remarks. One story is that of the Minister of Highways of the Government of India, Mr. Nitin Gadkari, briefing the Lok Sabha about a huge project to link India and Sri Lanka, or more particularly South India, Rameswaram, and North Sri Lanka, Talaimana. Now, this is not just a road and a railway and a bridge. The cost is, wait for it, 3.6 billion US dollars. An application has already been made to the Asian Development Bank. The link between South India and North Sri Lanka will consist of, among other things, a huge underwater tunnel through which ships can sail. That's why it's $3.6 billion. Now, India is a very rich country, but it can't afford this project. It's a huge project. And it has put forward a project proposal to the Asian Development Bank. Now, I don't know what Prime Minister Rajapaksa's policy is going to be, but I do know that any such thing will have to be looked at very carefully, will have to be debated in our parliament, and in the face of possible legal implications, might even have to go before the people at a referendum. Because that kind of integration, physical integration with the vast landmass of India would mean that in purely physical terms, we become an appendage of the subcontinent. And that has huge existential implications, not merely security implications. Our separate existence as a country, as a people, as a nation over millennia has been possible because we have a natural border, the sea, the 23 kilometers that the Indian minister referred to in his remarks about Sri Lanka, 23 kilometers of the Pork Strait. Now, if that is to be ended, then that's something that I would prefer Mahinda Rajapaksa to be looking at rather than Ranil Wickremesinghe. Now, there's a specific reason for this. One of our retired senior diplomats, Mr. Kalyananda Godage, who has no reason to propagandize on behalf of President Rajapaksa because he was dismissed, I believe, unfairly by the previous administration from his post as High Commissioner in Malaysia. He's written a very important article to the island. He wrote 2 pieces on this, followed by a piece yesterday by one of our most distinguished retired civil servants, Tissa Devendra. It's about this link, the India-Lanka link, which he says spells doom for Sri Lanka. Now, Kalyananda Godage tells us whose idea it was. Now, I must say, to be fair by India, India is not trying to impose something on us. Somebody here agreed to it. Otherwise, India could not ask for that kind of money from the Asian Development Bank. And Mr. Godage has informed all of us who it was. It was Prime Minister Wickremesinghe in 2002. I don't trust such a person who can trifle with the very existence of an independent Sri Lanka as an island. I don't trust such a person to be Prime Minister. I don't want him as Prime Minister when we have to face such a prospect. That is one big story. That's why it's not about whether you're sending crooks to Parliament, it's about our existence. The other story, and I shall complete my speech with that reference, is something that appeared in the Economic Times of New Delhi. And the story broke today, I believe. I read it today. The Prime Minister of India, Mr. Modi, whom I certainly admire for his economic performance and the confidence he has given India, visited Madam Jayalalitha, Chief Minister Jayalalitha, at her residence. And the Chief Minister, who was very much back in action, presented Prime Minister Modi with a memorandum. The memorandum stated that, in her expert opinion, India should push for further decentralization of power in Sri Lanka, which would eventually make way for Tamileelam. I mean, she actually says this in a memorandum. This is not in a public speech to get cheers. This is in a memorandum handed by the Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu to the Prime Minister of India. She goes on to say that the 13th Amendment to the Sri Lankan Constitution should be implemented in such a manner that it becomes a springboard for Tamileelam. Now, this is in writing, ladies and gentlemen. This is in writing. The UPFA manifesto has a moderate middle path concerning Sri Lanka's ethnic issue. It's a two-pronged proposal. One is that while we shall not go beyond the unitary framework and the 13th Amendment, there's no question of going beyond the 13th Amendment, we shall strengthen the system of provincial councils and local authorities in order to facilitate the political resolution of what has been called the ethnic problem in Sri Lanka. The second prong is a national harmony charter and the National Harmony and Reconciliation Commission. Now, that is our proposal, which is moderate, it is modest. It avoids the extremes of the JVP, which pledges to dismantle the provincial council system, and on the other hand, the TNA, which launched its election campaign in Marudana Madam on the 25th of July with Mr. Sambandhan in the chair, and in a grotesque event, had many speakers, almost every speaker, reiterating that their eternal leader, the undisputed leader, was Mr. Velupille Prabhakaran. The UNP, not to be outdone, had Madam Vijayakala Maheshwaran promising to erect a statue to Mr. Prabhakaran, provided President Rajapaksa can prove that he's dead. and gives a death certificate. If there's no death certificate, you don't believe that Prabhakaran is dead, and if there is a death certificate, there's going to be a statue if the UNP is voted to office. Now that's the UNP. According to the Sunday Times political column, the Deputy Minister of the UNP, Ms. Maheswaran, refused to hoist the Sri Lankan flag at Jaffna's Hartley College last week at the commencement of a T20 cricket tournament. So that's the UNP, this is the TNA, and I can't tell one from the other. They all look alike to me, I'm afraid, at this point in time. So when Chief Minister Jayalalitha urges in writing that devolution be stretched to the point that it makes for Tamalilam, and when a minister of the government of India talks about a 3.6 billion, actually applied for 3.6 billion US dollar project to connect North Sri Lanka with southern India, including with an underwater tunnel through which ships can go through, I much prefer Mahinda Rajapaksa as Prime Minister making the decisions, because I know that he would have the core national interests of the country at heart, and I'm not at all sure that Mr. Wickremesinghe would propose such a thing as this physical connection can be trusted to bear Sri Lanka's national interests at heart. That's not what his track record shows. Having said that, I would like to thank you and conclude my remarks and remind you that when you go to the polls on August 16th, don't be diverted by the gossip. Keep the big picture in mind and pick the better man. Thank you.